You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host Jimmy Petruzzi on the Friday Sports Show, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate on this show to have some very fascinating guests. We bring you guests from different components for sports, some of the world's best athletes, sports people. We speak to trainers, coaches, footballers, and we've also have this fascinating new segment where we speak to people in the field of psychology and related fields. We're very fortunate to have some very influential people in the field of psychology, some interesting views and ideas, who've been kind enough to sort of share their research, their ideas, their philosophies on the show. Some really influential, interesting people. Today we have a really fascinating guest. Really interesting insight into her area of psychology. She is a senior lecturer in psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University, Dr. Jenny Cole. So welcome to the show, Jenny. Great to have you on board.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting work that you do, and I suppose if we can sort of start from the beginning, what sort of motivated you, Jenny, to get into psychology? What was your motivation for going into the field?
I think I've always, as far as I can remember, I've always been interested in psychology. So there was an option at my school to study psychology when I was 14, 15, so sort of doing GCSEs. Yeah. So I actually signed up for an extra in the evening GCSE in psychology, but they didn't run it in the end because they didn't have enough people.
Okay, yeah.
It's just me there going, yeah, I'll do another one. I think learning how things work is a fascination of mine. So I like science in general from that perspective. And there is nothing more complicated and interesting than people. Mm-hmm. So kind of learning how people work, or the ideas about how people work, because will we ever know how people actually work? Mm-hmm. That's just a fascination, and has been for a long time in my education. So I've been very single-minded that, I tried to study it before I could. And then, when I was sort of doing my A-levels at 17, 18, that was it. Psychology was there, and I was always going to do it for degree level, and then I just carried on.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, and I think the sort of your area of research is quite fascinating. And just for the our listeners, if you just want to share what your area of research has been predominantly in, Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit like a research magpie. So I do get distracted by shiny things. And so if you look at my list of publications, there's all sorts on there, from women's health to gossip to social delusions to all sorts. But the thing I've been most recently focusing on is bodies and video gaming.
No, that's really interesting, and you mentioned that, and obviously obviously many people probably weren't aware that the seminar that you did deliver for the BPS Northwest, and was scheduled to deliver again, but unfortunately, COVID had to be suspended till further notice. But when you delivered the seminar, it was really fascinating. A lot of people spoke highly of it, Jenny, and sort of correct me if I'm wrong, but it was sort of, we sort of hear a lot about the impact of idealised bodies in mass media, and we see there's a lot of research around that in the media. But with yourself, you sort of went into the impact of social media and gaming as well. And can you tell us about the impact that gaming has on virtual bodies as such?
There's lots of kind of different strands to the influence, I guess. So I've looked mostly at the characters that people play in video games. And even though digital gaming is an interactive medium, so you're potentially going to get more immersed and involved in it than, say, TV, films, magazines, that sort of thing. And it's received not very much attention at all in the body image literature. There's only, before I sort of started looking at it, only really a couple of studies had looked at it. And mostly focusing on men and looking at muscularity. Because I think that comes from that traditional stereotype that it's only men who video game. And actually, if you look at the statistics, they hover around the 50-50 mark between men and women in terms of who considers himself a gamer. So what I wanted to look at was, okay, we know that yes, there are these muscular ideals, and we've also, anyone who's played a video game will probably at some point have seen a very hypersexualized female character as well. They can be quite common. And I wanted to see, well, what are female gamers' experiences of playing with these characters? Does it has the potential to have more of an effect, maybe, but being a gamer is very different to being a passive watcher of TV, for example, or consumer of print media. So I think I felt that I didn't want to assume that gamers are going to get sucked in and be more influenced. I thought it might be quite complicated. And certainly that's what so I've got qualitative data talking to women gamers, and certainly the qualitative data, which obviously you can't generalise to a whole female gamer population, suggests that it is complicated, and that women actually are quite savvy, or certainly like to talk about themselves as quite savvy, and not taken in by the sexy women, the hypersexualized women that they see in video games. So they kind of presented this story to me of, oh yeah, they're just for the men. We don't need to pay attention to that. We know what we're doing. And we talk about a lot of things to kind of indicate to us as researchers that they were experienced, skilled gamers, and therefore it didn't bother them because they knew exactly how to manipulate their environment to make sure that, if it bothered them, they didn't come across them.
That was really interesting, and I mean, you mentioned there that sort of 50-50 between, say, male female. I honestly wouldn't have been aware of that. I thought it would have been probably predominantly male. That's probably my sort of short-sightedness, or stereotype. But that's really fascinating stuff. But when you sort of say it's a 50-50 split, Jenny, is that do women play different games than men, or do they play similar games? Is that something that you looked at as well, or in terms of their choice of what they decide to participate in?
Certainly the women that I spoke to, I didn't notice a pattern, but obviously with it not being quantitative research, with it being qualitative, it's just kind of the names of the games kind of came up in a not very organised way.
Yes.
So I'd, giving them a questionnaire with tick boxes and things. But what I did notice about my data is that the women were very keen to bring up what are considered big masculine games. So things that, I'm trying to think of an example, but the only example I can think of is Call of Duty, and none of them played that. Things like World of Warcraft. So really big franchises that would be traditionally considered male oriented and geared towards male gamers. They would bring up that sort of thing, and made sure to bring up games that were considered quite skillful, or that only hardcore, in inverted commas, gamers would play. So they were wanting to show basically that they were skilled and they knew what they were doing by how they talked about the games that they played. And I think in terms of more generally whether women tend to play different types of video games than men, there's some suggestion that you might find more women playing casual mobile games than you would men. But that's not always borne out in the data. I think it depends who you're asking, what age range and that sort of thing. There's a really kind of cute statistic that I think is still true, that there are more women over 30 who game than there are boys under 18.
Wow. I'm fascinated by that. I mean, when we sort of think gaming, for me, it's sort of, I sort of go back to sort of my childhood gaming years, and the sort of gaming we used to do was, the old Intellivision or Atari, so to speak. And exactly, that's how far back I go. And then you had the old Commodore computer and so on and so forth. And gaming's changed a lot, I know that, over the years. And I suppose, it's one of them things, really, each to their own. Some people find it interesting. I mean, it might be outside the scope of your research, Jenny, but I'm wondering what's the motivation for say, I'm quite fascinated by those stats that, women over 30 game as much as or more than young men in that respect. But what is the motivation generally for gaming? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I'm sort of quite intrigued. That might be another research question for another day. But what sort of is the motivation to game? I sort of, I'll be quite truthful. I'm sort of, gaming's changed so much over the years. I don't quite understand what the drive is.
I think people who aren't gamers do have that question. Why? Why would you bother? And I know people. I'm a gamer myself, so I've been asked that question. And the answer is there isn't one answer. So the answer I would give you as to why I game might be completely different to why someone else you ask games. There's a book I'd recommend that I recently read called "Lost in a Good Game" by Pete Etchells, which gives a really, really nice overview of the research in gaming, but also it tells quite a nice story about the importance of gaming to gamers and some of the reasons why gaming might be important. And he talks about all the different types of needs that gaming can fulfill. And for some people, different needs are appropriate to others. So it might be a need for escapism or de-stressing. It might be a need for social connection. It might be a need for intellectual challenge. And people will have different combinations of those, and people will have different needs that they need, that they want to fulfill on a given day with a given game. So you can't really give like one answer to that. But one thing that's been really interesting that I've been reading about is the idea of flow. So I can't pronounce the name of the author who originated the concept. I think it was in the 70s. Yes, I think but that idea of kind of really getting lost in what you're doing, so that everything else kind of disappears and time disappears and you just get really lost in what you're doing. And lots of gamers find that sort of state in video gaming as well. And with different types of games, some games lend themselves more towards that sort of state than others. But that's also something that crops up in gamers' accounts. So getting completely absorbed in something, and something that might require you to be creative or might require you to problem solve, and everything kind of falls away for a bit.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. And I suppose for me, one of the reasons why I don't game, Jenny, is I think I'm one of them sort of people that if I did, could get addicted to it and sort of be up until the all hours trying to get through another level. And I suppose this is sort of outside the scope of the research too, but would you not say there's some sort of, really clever people, so to speak, behind these sort of games and using operant conditioning and sort of getting people and drawing people in, and it's hard to sometimes break that cycle. Like you got these levels, and like I said, I think games have obviously come a long way since many years ago, and they're so useful as well. There's some educational games too that are quite good and many things. But do you not think sometimes that there is that sort of that sort of conditioning and possible it can be addictive as well?
I think the kind of overall panic about gaming addiction, I don't really see the convincing evidence for it as a whole. Yes. Yeah. But I think certainly Jamie Madigan, who has written a book called Getting Gamers, has talked a lot about this and looked at things like there's something in some kinds of games called loot boxes, where you can get them and you don't know what you're going to find in the loot box. It could be something rubbish, or it could be the best weapon that you need to defeat everybody in a given game. And that you can, in some games, you can buy the chance to open more loot boxes, and obviously that starts to draw parallels with gambling. And when gaming is starting to draw a parallel with gambling, I think that's when we need to get concerned about addiction. And Pete Etchells talks about this in his book as well, actually. But that we can't really say that gaming as a whole is addictive. There's been some studies about gaming addiction and changes in brain activation and things like that. And a lot of the time, yes, there is changes in brain activation for people who game more, but a lot of the time people aren't gaming to the extent where it's causing them a problem. So it is a very complicated area, the idea of gaming addiction, but certainly some companies are guilty of adding things into games that get people to behave in certain ways related to the game. So a lot of the time in mobile games, that's used to you say this game is free, but if you want to play it properly, you're going to have to pay real money for this in-game currency that will then buy you all the weapons and kit that you need. And it's those sorts of scenarios where we genuinely need to be concerned, and that's also the kind of scenarios that kids get sucked into a lot of the time as well.
I can imagine, and I suppose in one sense it's almost like that sort of reward that one gets immediately after, so they've gone up a level, and I suppose they're quite vulnerable in terms of sort of maybe purchasing, and so that I guess that is obviously important in that respect. But sort of, I know we went off piece a little bit there. I find it really fascinating. I'm sure the listeners do too. In terms of your own research, what were your sort of thoughts around body image as a whole and gaming? How influential? I mean, you mentioned obviously that people you'd spoken to and gave us an insight, but from a broader perspective, how influential do you think it is for the gamers in terms of their?
So, because my research is qualitative, then obviously I'd be quite reluctant to draw sweeping generalisations. But the impression I get from my participants was that they're not really bothered. That yes, these things influence their body image, but it's not coming from gaming.
Yes,
it's coming from elsewhere. That's my sort of feeling from the data that I've got. Yeah. And I certainly would agree with that as a gamer myself as well. There are lots of pressure on me as a woman to look a certain way, but I don't think it comes from Princess Peach. Okay, she's a bit of a rubbish example, because that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about sexualized characters in games. But the women that we spoke to talked a lot about knowing that it's just pixels, and because you can see how an avatar changes depending on the parameters that you put on it on the games where you can customize them. Then it's just not the same thing. Something like social media, where you're seeing filtered images of everyday people presented as if they're candid shots, that to me is potentially more problematic than seeing a really extreme figure in a video game.
Yes.
A lot of the women I spoke to had senses of humour about it. Like, one of them said, I think it's Saints Row 3 they were playing, for anyone who's out there and plays video games. And she said, I just made my character a massive fat woman in a bikini.
Wow, yeah.
So, they're really playing around with it where they can. And so my feeling is that this viewpoint is maybe a bit more widespread, and the things we need to worry about regarding good body image aren't necessarily coming from games.
No, that's
or only games.
Yeah, and of course, I suppose it would be multifactorial. There's a lot of things out there. I think that's really interesting, and I think the thing I find interesting is how they differentiate. It seems to me, from what you're saying there, at least my interpretation is that they have the ability to differentiate between this sort of virtual reality and we want to call it reality, and probably wouldn't say it's a sense of reality, but the images they see on social media. Is it because they are aware this is a game? They kind of go in there. It's more like entertainment, but I suppose they use social media as a different mechanism as well, and obviously TV as well. It's like more real life images. Is that influential, do you think, Jenny, in body image?
Yeah, I think so. And I think all the women that I spoke to they all identified themselves as a gamer. So we didn't really kind of police what that was. We just said, if you identify as a gamer, come and take part in the study. And so for the most part, they were very experienced with the medium. And so I think people who are very experienced gamers, they know maybe a bit more. You get to know kind of common mechanics in video games. Oh, this is that sort of character, they'll be able to do this. And that experience helps you to see it not as a genuine source of comparison. Whereas when you're seeing real people on a social media feed, suddenly they become a bit more, they are a bit more realistic for comparison than, Lara Croft.
Yes. No, that's really interesting stuff. And I suppose in one sense what I'm sort of curious to know is, and I'm sure the listeners are too, I mean, you mentioned there the gaming community amongst women over 30 years of age. Is that sort of down to sort of mobile phone, do you think, as well, having a mobile phone there and possibly sort of seeing opportunities to play games? And is there any sort of correlation to think between, say, the mobile phone being a big part of our lives as well?
I think possibly, yeah. There's a lot of snobbery in gaming. So a lot of gamers you talk to would say, if they're playing Candy Crush, that's not proper gaming.
Okay.
And on the one hand, the professional side of me thinks, well, that's gatekeeping and that's sexist. And but the gamer in me is going, yeah, Candy Crush is the proper game. So I think mobile has got something to do with that. Also, I think the way that the game industry is now is that there are so many games that you don't have to play the mainstream stereotypical games. I think, when the game industry started in the UK, it was mostly guys coding in their bedrooms. Yes. And I think we have got this huge multi-million-dollar industry, or million-pound industry, but we've also got a lot of indie studios coming through as well. There's now lots of ways for indie studios to share their outputs. So if you don't want to, if you think Grand Theft Auto is sexist and boring, then fine, you can play something on an indie from an indie studio that's a bit more interesting. So I think that range has meant that it appeals to a wider range of people as well.
Absolutely. I mean, mine was Football Manager as a youngster growing up. I used to imagine being a football. My goal was to take the least unknown football team all the way to the top to win all sorts, really. And it did get sort of, I wouldn't say addictive in one sense. You had a degree of control over participation, but equally, even now, sometimes it can be, like you've mentioned there, it can be, enjoyable as well to do, and I suppose the graphics as well. I mean, in terms of your own experience, Jenny, the graphics these days, and I think one thing that sort of really interests me about your research as well is the graphics that have changed in games. Now, I mean, years ago when I was playing games, basically when they first sort of came out, you just had like stick figures as footballers, and then it changed. They became more and more real in their appearance. And I suppose, like looking at your research, and you sort of talked about hypersexualized game characters, and in one sense, they can. I mean, they don't look real as such, but they're getting closer and closer to looking like reality, I think. And do you think the sort of graphics has had a big impact in the way people see games too? The way that the graphics are and the games themselves, they're just so innovative now, and it's almost like you're really driving a car, you're really out there. There's like a real virtual reality.
There's some research to show that as graphics have become better, the bodies that you see in video games conform more to a Western stereotype. Okay. Yeah. So for women, that would be very, very thin, large bust, white, tall, leggy, that sort of image. So there would be evidence to suggest that as the graphics get better, there's more of a problem. But certainly that didn't come out in the stories that my participants told me. They didn't really talk about, because they basically were like, I'm not bothered. So they were like, I don't care how good the graphics are, I couldn't care less. Yes. And also it's quite interesting that there's a bit of a kind of resurgence of retro graphics that I think we've maybe got to a certain point of hyper-realistic graphics, and a lot of, especially the smaller studios, are actually going back to kind of 16-bit appearance. Wow. It's quite trendy at the moment to make your game look like it could fit on a floppy disk.
So we might have Space Invaders make a comeback and Pac-Man. Yeah. But no, it's really interesting, because I suppose on the other side of the other thing too as well, it's like I've spoken to athletes, and I've had the opportunity to work with sports people and athletes, and some of them, the gaming they do is more related to their competition, where they try and create a virtual reality. Say a cyclist might be sort of practicing in, if they don't get the opportunity to travel somewhere before competition, they create this sort of reality as close as they can do in the game itself. And it really is high-tech stuff, Jenny. It's really fascinating how they can do that. I mean, in terms of your research, what sort of where do you sort of go from here in terms of what you've been researching? What's your sort of vision? And I know you sort of mentioned before you kind of are quite flexible and have looked at a number of different areas, but where do you sort of see yourself going from where you are now?
I think the idea of representing ourselves in a virtual space is really interesting to me. So I'd done another study which talked to women gamers about the decisions they make about avatars.
Okay, wow.
And that particular study, a lot of the women talked about, oh, well, you know, with an avatar you can do what you want and it's a fantasy and it's fantastic. But all the things that they said suggested that actually the real world does intrude on that fantasy, whether we like it or not. So a lot of the time they felt that, well, they'd have to choose their avatar carefully if they're going to be online, because if they're identifiable as female, they might get more abuse. And but sometimes they would deliberately go to a masculine extreme to present themselves as masculine to avoid that abuse, but also to kind of go away from that girly stereotype. You have to kind of prove yourself if you're a women gamer. And so how you present yourself in your avatar is very much linked to that. And I think there's lots of different populations that will have all sorts of different complex issues around how they manage their appearance virtually versus their experiences in the real world. If you think about different ethnicities, you know, how would that operate? Different gender identities, for example, you know, what is that like? Because those issues are so different to just thinking about, oh, you know, men or women. That's really interesting to me. You know, do you want to replicate? If you're part of a minority, do you want to maintain that minority and identity because it's important to you when you're choosing your avatar? Or do you want to try things out? Do you want to try being a member of the majority for a while and see how it goes? And, you know, we don't really have the answers to those questions in terms of asking people to properly explain what's going on for them.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting stuff. I find that interesting because, I mean, many years ago, Jenny, I had a teaching role with sort of younger people in sort of you know, disadvantaged schools, and sometimes we'd put the games on and play like the football games, but there was a certain game where you could sort of choose to sort of build your own avatar footballer, so to speak, and you could sort of choose the athleticism, you could choose the body type, and I just found it really intriguing, the choice that some of the young people had made in terms of their football and how it sort of reflected their persona in many ways. And this was sort of male and female. I think it was almost like a reflection of how they identified or want to identify for themselves, you know. So it was quite interesting stuff, really. And so in terms of choosing an avatar, you sort of mentioned there, I mean, what are your thoughts around that? I mean, in terms of, say, you know, obviously there's various factors in avatar choice, but what would you say are some of the most common themes in someone saying, okay, that looks like an avatar that I want to sort of portray?
I think the one thing that sort of jumped out from my research is that you can't consider people's avatar choices in a vacuum. That you really need to see people or you know, ask people about their avatar choices with a specific context in mind, because maybe left completely free to do what they wanted. So, for example, a game where you're not interacting online with other people when you're at home and it's just you that's going to see it, you might make very different decisions to if you're going to be on a multiplayer online game where you've got to just not just think about who you want to be, but who you want to be seen as.
Yes.
So I think that's a really important distinction, and that you're going to choose. And then this previous research has shown this as well. You're going to choose very, very differently depending on who you're playing with, whether you know them or not, their gender, their race, all these things. You know, how experienced a gamer they are. Like, there's all sorts of factors that will come into that decision. So context is just so important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose in saying that too, I know it's sort of outside the scope of the research, but also in terms of gaming online, there's a sort of safety thing as well too. One would think in terms of, I mean, I'm not a gaming expert by any stretch of the imagination, but in one sense it's sort of like, you know, gaming online, sort of not knowing, and I mean, are there sort of controls, Jenny, for that in terms of people sort of maybe sort of, you know, not knowing who you're gaming with and that sort of stuff? You know, I suppose, yeah. I
think it's a constant struggle for online games to figure out how to address it, really. And some games have more problems than others.
Yes.
So I never game online with other people, ever. Just because if I do, it's with people I already know.
Of course,
Just because it's more straightforward, you're not exposing yourself to unpredictable interactions with people, quite safe with that sort of thing. So, and I think a lot of people make that sort of decision, especially women gamers.
Yes.
Or they, something like World of Warcraft will have different guilds, and I think that people who are likely to have problematic interactions because of abuse in those sorts of games will find corners of those games that are safe. And so there will be guilds that are focused on LGBT plus people, or on women gamers, or whatever it might be.
So they've got like a safe space for themselves to play and enjoy themselves, and not have to sort of be too concerned about the abuse that they may get. I suppose in one sense, you mentioned there sort of the abuse. I mean, I suppose it would be easier for one person to give abuse to somebody else if it's not a personalised thing as well, where it's a bit like social media in one sense. People sometimes can use it as a platform for giving other people abuse, but obviously there isn't that personalised things. If someone knows someone sort of personally, or identifies them as being a person, so to speak, rather than just someone playing a game, then they may be more sensitive to them, do you think?
Yeah, and I think the idea of how we behave differently online is kind of just a societal issue. So whether you're talking about gaming or other online comments on news articles on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, anything you can think of, that is a perennial problem, and a lot of the platforms just haven't got their head around what to do effectively. And a lot of users have ideas about what they should do, but the platforms seem a lot of the time either it's technically difficult, or they are reluctant to sort of limit the freedom of their users in some way. And so it's an issue that is kind of a modern puzzle that applies to all sorts of online platforms.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. And I suppose there's no easy solution to sort of complexities. And for the most part, I think a lot of people use it for in a positive way as well. And especially where gaming is concerned, people can enjoy it, and if they enjoy it, it's non-intrusive, and it gives them some sort of, whether they game or some people, everyone's got different things that they enjoy doing. For some, whether it's escapism or just pure enjoyment, then it's entirely up to them in terms of what they decide to do. But it's been really fascinating. I'm sort of mindful of time. You've been very kind enough to speak to us, Jen. It's been really fascinating. I'm sure the listeners have found that really intriguing. It'd be great to maybe follow up sometime and sort of see what you're up to in the world of research going forward. But I really want to thank you for coming on board the show, Jenny. It's been really interesting and informative. And
no problem.
So thank you very much. So that was Dr. Jenny Cole, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University, who spoke about gaming. What a fascinating insight. I certainly found it really intriguing. I'm sure you did. As always, feel free to drop us an email on our Facebook page. Any questions, comments, otherwise, related to this interview, any other interviews that we have as well. So really fascinating interview by Dr. Jenny Cole. Really, really interesting stuff. You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host Jimmy Petruzzi on the Friday Sports Show, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate on this show to bring you some of the world's best sports people, athletes from around the world, who give us some interesting insights into their role in sport, athletes, sports people who work in sport as well, across a broad range of areas, such as coaches, trainers. But we've also started a new segment speaking to people who work in the field of psychology and related disciplines, and we're very fortunate to have some of the world's leading figures in the area to speak about what they do and some of their research and their views on the field of their area of specialism. Today we have a really fascinating guest. It's a big area, really. A really interesting area we're going to talk about today. I think that you're going to be really fascinated. I certainly am looking forward to speaking to today's guest and talking more about what has been defined as imposter syndrome. And it's really interesting because it's certainly my experience of working with people across a broad range of areas, I find it quite fascinating, and I've come across the term on a number of occasions. But we're going to get someone who's going to give us a really interesting insight into her thoughts in the area, and it's Dr. Laura Kilby, reader in social psychology at Sheffield Hallam University. Dr. Laura Kilby, welcome welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Hi there, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, really interesting concept, imposter syndrome. I mean, how would you define it, Laura? What are your thoughts on imposter syndrome? What would you say it is?
So I guess fundamentally people experience it as a kind of a really deep-rooted sense of fraudulence in their professional life. And the kind of research around imposter syndrome teases out, I guess, three main features. The first one is that people who experience it, they tend to have quite a firmly held belief that other people, the people around them, have got an overinflated perception of their abilities. So they think, they're concerned that the people around them think they're much better than they actually believe themselves to be in their job.
Yeah.
Coupled with that, there is a sort of, it goes hand in hand with a fear then that the true abilities are going to be found out. So there is this sense of kind of constant anticipation and worry and fear that somebody's going to kind of realise that this kind of fraudulent person. And then the last thing is that they tend to have a kind of a constant sort of persistent tendency to attribute their successes to external factors. So when they do well, they put that down to it being luck or just good fortune rather than a result of their own ability.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and certainly on my journey, Laura, I've spoken to people who've almost like labelled themselves as well without sort of probably knowing too much about it. It's kind of a label out there, and I suppose you think in one sense, do you think that there's sort of a danger in sometimes people sort of labelling themselves as having imposter syndrome without sort of knowing the full implications, like you've mentioned there? It's quite interesting your take on it. Do you sort of see a potential sort of danger in labelling ourselves?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think increasingly we see the language of imposter syndrome being discussed and talked about, and in many respects that's a good thing because it means people are feeling confident to sort of open up about their fears or their worries. But there's a kind of an interesting balance to be struck, I think, between what might be a reasonable level of kind of self-doubt or a kind of the opposite of being overly confident, just having a measured sense of your ability and perhaps sometimes being a bit doubtful.
Yeah.
And then, how that slips over for some people into actually being a really maladaptive feature of their sense of who they are and what they're capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think as well as that, I mean, on the other side of things, there's sort of the confidence type thing where I suppose in one sense where if we're sort of competent in an area and we sort of lack the confidence, then that can be an issue. But we don't have the competence, then you could make an argument. Say, for example, I wouldn't be confident doing surgery, and rightly so, because I'm not a medical person. That's not a bad thing in one sense. But on the other side of things, there are a lot of people out there that are certainly capable of doing what they would like to do. They sort of may lack the confidence. Does that sort of tie into imposter syndrome, Laura? Is that sort of does that sort of tie into people sort of feeling the imposter syndrome? And what do psychologists think drive imposter syndrome?
So the kind of very early work on this, it was originally work that developed in the 1970s. US academics Pauline Clance and Susan Eames were starting to notice that many of the successful women around them in their own professional circles seemed to doubt the roots of their own success.
Yeah.
So that led to some research, and there was quite a large study of about 150 women who were objectively very successful. So these are people who are doing well in their careers, according to all sort of external objective measures, are successful. But what they found was that, throughout those interviews, that many of their participants really struggled to legitimise their own success, regardless of how much sort of objective information might tell them that they were doing well.
Yeah.
And they very much sort of attribute their successes to external factors, so luck, or thinking that it was as a result of having colleagues who were supportive and so forth. And then this kind of persistent fear of being viewed by others as unworthy or being found out. So I think, where we see people who seem to experience this imposter phenomenon, it's where they are objectively, are doing really well. So it's you're quite right in saying there's lots of things out there that it's a really good thing we recognise we can't do and we don't try to do. But where we're sort of successful in our own careers, that's where we tend to see that for some people there's a disconnect between what's objectively going on and how they're experiencing it. And that can be in all range of careers, from, I guess, people in sort of sporting and, high performance environments like that.
Absolutely.
But across a whole range of sectors. And whilst that early work was very much, the sort of thinking was that this was something that was very much experienced by women primarily, the work that's gone on over the course of the past 40 years is sort of flagging up that actually this is something that can be experienced by men and women.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting you say. I mean, years ago, I remember working with someone. I was doing some sort of coaching, and I'm not going to sort of name the organisation for confidentiality, but he worked very high up in this organisation at sort of director level, and it was quite interesting because I was working with him, and he said himself, Laura, he felt he had imposter syndrome. He had a promotion, so he moved from one sort of role to another, and he went as high as you could be from a senior authority in the organisation, and from the outside in, no one would probably ever guessed it, the way he sort of carried himself and the way he would communicate. And I was quite fascinated. Fascinated is maybe the wrong word. I was quite intrigued how someone who was so highly regarded by everyone and from the outside looking in didn't sort of show any signs. When we sort of talked about things in a more deeper level, said that he felt that he wasn't worthy of the role, and I was really intrigued. And what's your take on why do some people feel it more than others? I mean, why do some people actually feel more of like an imposter than other people?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think so. There's two things you said there. One is that that recognition that you had that somebody who for all their external appearances was incredibly successful, was experiencing these feelings of imposterism. And one of the issues is it is something which I think people really struggle to speak openly about, because they're concerned that if they put name to those feelings, it sort of confirms that they are an imposter. So there is an issue there about people being able to sort of share that they have those feelings. I think in terms of what causes it, I mean, that's always $1 million question, isn't it? There is research that has sort of tried to make sense of the causes. I guess the most direct cause, so the kind of direct link is that it's caused by an inability to be able to kind of accurately self-assess our performance. But I suppose the more interesting question is, well, why is that? Why can't we make those accurate self-assessments? Some studies have found that there are links to kind of family background. So, for example, one study found that it was more prevalent amongst people who were first generation to exceed the norms of their family. So, where somebody's the first person, perhaps first generation of their family at university, or first person to have substantial success in a particular field or career, that seems to be, there's more prevalence there. There is research that also has linked it to parental styles. So there's some really interesting research that's found, for example, correlations between people who experience this sense of imposterism and experiences of heightened parental control during childhood. There was a really interesting study back in 2010 that explored this relationship between parenting styles and imposter syndrome, and those authors argued that this phenomenon of imposterism in part linked to what they talked about as significant long-term effect of childhood parentification. And what they mean by parentification is where we have a child who is taking on adult responsibilities at long time before they're kind of developmentally ready for adult responsibilities. And what they were arguing was that as children grew up, they were sort of experiencing or having to live the life of an adult while still a child, so there was a kind of a sense of fraudulence in their childhood, and that they argue that carried over into adult life, so they kind of internalised this sense of identity, this schema about who they are as a person, as being somebody who's inauthentic, and that can then feed into their professional life. So there's there's some ideas about parenting, but there's probably a lot of complex factors. There's other research that suggests that personality type can play a part. as you might imagine, people who show higher levels of conscientiousness in their personality tend to also show higher levels of imposterism. And there's some interesting recent work that looks at the prevalence of imposter syndrome amongst people from underrepresented racial, ethnic and religious minority groups. And again, there's indication there that where people are from a minority group that are potentially less represented in a particular work environment, there is again a greater likelihood of experiencing imposterism.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm sort of guessing that, from what you say there, things are sort of multifactorial, it's a sort of combination of factors, and I suppose it's sort of the perfect storm in one sense where it's a combination of factors that take someone to where they are. In one sense, what sort of intrigues me is that, I mean, it can work to a point. I think having being conscientious is a positive thing in many ways. It can work to a point. But then equally in saying that, if it sort of crosses a sort of fine line where, at what point does it become an issue for people or to have this imposter syndrome? Where do you sort of draw the line between, having some doubt may be a good thing, but then having too much doubt can be debilitating? At what point does it become maladaptive for people? What are some of the, have you sort of come across anything to sort of suggest that this can be maladaptive for people?
Yeah, so I think, the tricky question is at what point, because I guess it's one of the challenges I was saying is that it's something that people find quite hard to talk about openly, because in talking about it, it kind of confirms, their concern is it confirms that they are a fraud.
Yes.
So people struggle to talk about it. What we do know is that, the upshot of somebody experiencing it is that it can be, as you can imagine, absolutely exhausting.
Yes.
And what can happen is obviously there's a number of things. So it can leave work being absolutely devoid of any pleasure. It's been linked to, long-term stress and anxiety amongst people who experience it, and also a higher risk of burnout. And I think the reason for that is because it often leads people, so there is research that shows what happens is it leads people to engage in maladaptive behaviours that are kind of linked to perfectionism.
Yes. So
people tend to over-prepare, they overthink, and they also overestimate the significance of mistakes. Now, in the workplace, mistakes happen, we have problems, things don't always go to plan. When those things happen to somebody who's experiencing a really strong sense of imposterism, that leads them into a really negative cycle. And what tends to happen is that the feelings of being an imposter kind of ironically create a cycle whereby we work even harder to try and compensate for those feelings. So we become even more conscientious. We try and mask what we perceive as our kind of fraudulent success. And of course what happens is that hard work, that extra work that we're doing, often leads on to more professional success, because objectively we're being recognised for working and achieving. So we might get promoted or recognised for our achievements in other ways, and the more success we have, the greater the fraudulence feels. So people get trapped in this negative sort of maladaptive cycle where they feel fraudulent, so they work extra hard, so they get promoted, so they feel even more fraudulent. And so it's a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And in one sense, it's like they become that sort of chronic striver where it's never really enough. In one sense, too, where you could imagine that. And it's interesting you mentioned there perfectionism, and I think with perfectionism as well, sometimes it can spill into other areas of one's life too, as well. So, for example, if let's say someone's got like a certain job that requires a level of perfectionism, if they're sort of, maybe an engineer or something like that, on a plane, you'd want them to be a perfectionist to a point. But equally, it can spill into their sort of personal life too, where they kind of potter about the house, and does that happen with imposter syndrome too? Is it linked to just profession, or is it also from a personal point of view? People sort of maybe feel inadequate in other areas of their life too, Laura?
I think in terms of professions, in part it might be where it's been researched as opposed to where it's actually experienced, but certainly it's been documented in healthcare settings. It's been documented amongst people who work in finance, in accountancy, people working in law, in marketing, and there's been but probably the most amount of research has actually studied it in educational settings, and that's both amongst academics but also amongst students. And there's quite a lot of research now that has identified that students, can really fall victim to these feelings of imposterism. Now, whether or not how that plays out into people's other sides of their life outside of their profession, I don't actually know, but I guess some aspects of the kind of personality features that have been linked to people who experience imposterism might suggest that you might see some of that playing out in other parts of people's lives.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say. I think it's really fascinating, and certainly in sports, certainly in my experience of working with people in sport as well, it's quite surprising sometimes where certain people talk about, well, you've mentioned there, they talk about how they don't feel, they feel like a fraud. They don't feel that they don't feel the same way about themselves that they that other people do in one sense, like fans and coaches and so on and so forth. And it's quite interesting, really, because a lot of high achievers, Laura, who've got imposter syndrome too. And is that from the research you've done and your experience? Do you find that like the high achievers do? I mean, you mentioned there that people who do excel and do strive have that. Do you sort of find high achievers have this experience as well?
It tends to be sort of linked to this maladaptive cycle. So yes, unfortunately, what tends to happen is that people who are experiencing it are working even harder to try and prove their worth and to not, to sort of rid themselves of feeling fraudulent.
Yes.
And so they become increasingly recognised as high achieving in their particular profession. And I think the other thing is, we tend to see it, well, certainly the research that I'm aware of that's been done, we tend to see it in environments that are highly competitive, and where success is at least in part linked to kind of peer judgment. And you mentioned there, high achieving sports people, where the kind of, the fans, but also the experts around them really are kind of validating their success and their ability. This issue of peer judgment, I think, is part of it, because what we're relying on there as for our individual sense of how we're doing is somebody else telling us we're doing okay, as opposed to sort of an objective measure of how successful we are or we aren't. And again, we see that in higher education. So if we think about students, and as I mentioned, there's been research increasingly showing that students experience it. In most academic disciplines, success in education is based on the judgment of tutors, the judgment of our expert peers, as opposed to some objective measure, or even as opposed to, say, students being able to compare their work to work of their peers. And in the same way, amongst kind of academic success, there's a very intense competitive pressure to publish. And a successful publishing career relies on competing and succeeding through a process of peer review, and ultimately that peer review is, the expertise and judgment of our scientific peers deciding, what gets published. So I think that, that reliance that in so many professions, we take our cues for how we're doing from subjective measures.
That's really
what's
interesting.
available to us.
No, that's really interesting stuff, and certainly I can sort of relate to that in the sense that as a teacher myself, a lecturer myself, the students as well. And it's quite interesting you say is that, I mean, for example, if we do things like a role play or an assignment, and or maybe request work from the students, some of them, irrespective of how well they do, they don't seem to buy into their ability to sort of be able to graduate and sort of go on to a career. Sometimes there seems to be a belief issue around that. I find fascinating. And have you read that study, Laura? I think it was sort of came to mind. Is it Dunning-Kruger effect? I can't recall now, but it was a study or some research around sometimes people who are very good at what they do undermine themselves, and people who aren't necessarily that great, just go out there and do it. I mean, is there a case for that for some people who maybe don't have as much ability but just sort of go for it, and some people who do have a lot of ability tend to sort of play themselves down, do you think?
I I guess it's always a balance, isn't it? Of,
Yeah.
You know, you can have fantastic natural ability in somebody in any kind of profession, but then to really achieve, it's that combination of ability and an awful lot of hard work. And you sort of need those things to come together. And for some people, they perhaps start off with perhaps what's, you know, viewed as slightly more natural ability, and but at some point that hard work has to kick in.
Yes.
And for other people, they might see themselves as, you know, having to work incredibly hard to every aspect of their kind of career. I think, you know, you mentioned there about that kind of self-sabotaging. There is some research which suggests, you know, that what we can see amongst people who experience imposterism is that there is a constant downplaying of their own accomplishments, and in doing that, people can potentially start to sabotage their own career. You know, so they literally are talking themselves out of it. So again, that's something that can be a real challenge for people who are trying to, because, you know, for some people so I wrote about this issue of imposter syndrome at the start of the year, and it was published in The Psychologist, which is the flagship magazine of the British Psychological Society, so it's shared amongst members, and I was absolutely astonished at the response I received. So, you know, a huge number of kind of comments and tweets and feedback on social media of people just wanting to sort of say thank you for putting voice to the experiences, and also wanting to share their own experience. And I still get emails from people who come across the article, but what was really striking was the range of people who got in touch. So, you know, I had emails from really seasoned academics, from PhD students, from professional psychologists working in counselling and clinical roles, people who were retired, who said, you know, I experienced this all through my professional career. So the range of people that can experience this, you know, that there is a kind of a whole mix of people who have got clear ability, you know, that there is no doubt of their professional success or their, you know, their ability to achieve in their roles, and they can be aware of imposter syndrome as a kind of something that's out there that they've heard about, that they can talk about as you know, in a kind of an intellectual way, but they will still really struggle then to be able to say, well, if that's what I'm experiencing, that helps me change how I feel. It's like the feelings are still there, even though they're aware of it.
But I suppose having that self-awareness can be a sort of step in that sort of direction, where I suppose in one sense it can almost be denial. Sometimes we can be in denial that we do have, if someone does have imposter syndrome, there might be some sort of, you know, denial that it's not there. It might be something else. They might be looking to sort of justify and compare themselves and think, well, actually, you know what, I'm not that level yet. Do you think by being self-aware, it is a step in the right direction to be able to sort of move forward and beyond that sort of syndrome, to sort of move away from it and, you know, be a bit more relaxed about where we are and be a bit more focused and enjoy the journey too as well? And I mean, you mentioned the academia and sports as well, and I think sometimes it sort of takes away the pleasure of enjoying our learning as well, Laura, you know, just going with the flow and enjoying it too.
I think that's the biggest problem with it, actually, is that it sucks the pleasure out of somebody's professional life. And actually, you know, if you're somebody who is in an environment that you are sort of succeeding in, then there should be some pleasure attached to that success. You know, you'd hope that there would be some enjoyment attached to being able to have the privilege to work in an area that you probably enjoy, that you are achieving in, that you are, you know, fully embedded in. That should come with a level of professional satisfaction, and I think that's, you know, that's the real downside.